A 4,000-year-old mummy whose eyes were never fully closed. A human body dies, and within hours, something predictable happens. The muscles release, the tension disappears, and the eyelids fall shut for the final time. It is one of the most consistent biological endings we know. There are no exceptions, no conditions, no known reason for it to fail. And yet, in a sealed burial chamber, preserved across 4,000 years of silence, archaeologists found a body that did not follow that rule. The eyes were not open, but they were not closed either. They remained fixed in between, as if the moment of death had never fully completed. At first, it seemed like a small detail, something easy to ignore in the presence of a much larger discovery. The tomb itself was intact, the preservation unusually stable, the environment almost perfectly suited to slow decay. Everything about the site suggested control, intention, and careful preparation. But the eyes did not fit into that pattern. Because this was not the natural position of a dead body. It was something else. Something that should have corrected itself within hours, yet somehow remained unchanged for millennia. The more closely the researchers examined the mummy, the more precise the anomaly became. The eyelids were not randomly positioned, not distorted by damage or erosion. They were held in a specific, consistent state, partially lowered, exposing just enough of the eye to create the impression of awareness. Not life, but not absence either. And this is where the problem begins, because in known human biology, there is no stable state where the eyelids remain like this after death. The muscles responsible for blinking and closure do not pause. They complete their motion, and then they stop. So the first explanation seemed obvious. Perhaps the eyes were never closed during burial. In many ancient cultures, the responsibility of preparing the body fell to individuals with varying levels of skill. It is possible, even expected, that imperfections would occur. But that explanation quickly began to collapse under closer inspection. Because leaving the eyes open is not the same as preserving them in a halfway position. An open eye, exposed to air and time, degrades rapidly. The soft tissue retracts, the shape distorts, and within a relatively short period, the structure becomes unrecognizable. That is not what happened here. The form was maintained with a level of stability that suggested something far more deliberate. This is where the mystery deepens. Because to maintain that position, something must have prevented the natural relaxation of the eyelids. Either the muscles did not behave as expected, or something external intervened. And both possibilities lead to uncomfortable questions. If it was biological, then we are looking at a reaction that contradicts everything we understand about postmortem processes. If it was intentional, then we must ask why anyone would go to such lengths to preserve a human face in a state that mimics awareness. Archaeological records do offer a surface-level answer. In some ancient belief systems, the eyes were considered a gateway, not just a physical feature, but a symbolic connection between the living and the dead. Keeping the eyes visible, even partially, may have represented a form of vigilance, a way for the deceased to observe the world beyond death. But even within those traditions, the methods were usually symbolic rather than physical. Painted eyes, carved masks, or external representations were far more common than manipulating the actual body. What we see here is different. This is not symbolism placed on top of the body. This is the body itself being altered. And that distinction matters, because it suggests intention at a level that goes beyond ritual. It implies control over the biological process itself. Or at least an attempt to override it. When researchers analyzed the tissue around the eyes, they noticed subtle indications that the area had not simply been left alone. There were signs of preservation that did not fully match the rest of the face. Slight differences in texture, in the way the material responded to environmental exposure. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise a possibility that could not be ignored: the eyes may have been treated separately. That idea opened the door to a second layer of explanation. Perhaps the partially closed state was not a natural occurrence at all, but the result of a technique, something applied during or shortly after death to hold the eyelids in place. Early forms of binding, adhesives, or even simple mechanical positioning could, in theory, create this effect. But again, the details complicate the theory. Because maintaining such precision over thousands of years would require more than a temporary solution. It would require a method that could resist not just time, but the gradual breakdown of organic material. This is where scientific analysis becomes both helpful and frustrating. Modern imaging techniques allow researchers to examine internal structures without disturbing the mummy itself. And what they found did not provide a clear answer, only more contradictions. The muscle structures around the eyes did not appear frozen in tension, as one might expect if they had been artificially held. Instead, they showed signs of relaxation, consistent with normal postmortem behavior. In other words, the muscles behaved as they should have, but the eyelids did not follow. That disconnect creates a problem that is difficult to resolve, because it suggests that the visible position of the eyes is not entirely explained by muscle activity. Something else is influencing the outcome. Something structural, perhaps, or environmental, but not fully accounted for by existing models. And when a mystery reaches that point, it stops being about a single anomaly and starts becoming a question about the limits of our understanding. There are, of course, competing theories. Some researchers argue that the effect could be the result of dehydration patterns unique to the burial environment. As the body loses moisture, tissues shrink and shift in ways that are not always predictable. Under very specific conditions, it is possible that the eyelids could retract unevenly, creating the appearance of partial openness. It is a plausible explanation, grounded in known processes. But it comes with a limitation: it should not produce such a consistent and stable result. Variability would be expected. Imperfection would be unavoidable. Yet this case appears controlled, almost precise. Others suggest that what we are seeing is not preservation, but illusion. The human brain is remarkably sensitive to facial cues, especially those involving the eyes. Even a slight shadow or contour can create the impression of gaze, of awareness, of intention. Perhaps the eyes are not truly open at all, but shaped in a way that triggers that perception. But again, this explanation feels incomplete, because it shifts the mystery from the body to the observer, without fully addressing the physical structure that creates the effect in the first place. And then there is a more controversial possibility, one that sits at the edge of both science and interpretation: that the state of the eyes reflects the exact moment of death, preserved not just physically, but mechanically. In life, there are brief instants where the eyes are neither fully open nor fully closed. Transitions so quick that we rarely notice them. If death occurred during such a moment, could that position, under extremely rare conditions, be maintained? It is a question that does not have a clear answer. Because even if the position were captured, the body's natural processes should still override it within hours, unless something interrupted that process. This is where the mystery becomes personal, because it forces us to confront something we usually avoid: the exact nature of the moment when life ends. We imagine death as a clean transition, a clear boundary between before and after. But the reality may be less defined, more fragmented, more uncertain. And this mummy, with its half-closed eyes, seems to exist precisely in that uncertainty. Not fully in the world of the living, but not entirely removed from it either. Imagine standing in front of it. Not as a scientist, not as a researcher, but as a person. You look at the face, expecting stillness, expecting absence. But instead, you see something that feels almost responsive. Not moving, not alive, but not completely empty. And for a moment, your brain tries to resolve that contradiction. It searches for a familiar pattern, a known explanation. But none fully fit. And that is where the discomfort comes from. Not from what the mummy is, but from what it suggests. Because in the end, this is not just about one preserved body. It is about the assumptions we make about life, death, and everything in between. We rely on patterns, on rules, on expectations that help us make sense of the world. And most of the time, those rules hold. But every so often, something appears that does not follow them. Something that exists just outside the boundaries of what we consider normal. And when that happens, we are left with a choice. We can force the anomaly to fit our understanding,
Or we can accept that our understanding might not be complete.
That there are details, mechanisms, and moments we have not fully captured. The half-closed eyes of this mummy do not give us a clear answer.
They do not resolve into a simple explanation.
Instead, they remain exactly as they are, unfinished, unresolved, and quietly watching.
Because the moment you think you understand the eyes, another detail begins to emerge. And this one is harder to ignore.
When researchers moved beyond the surface and started examining the deeper tissue structures, they noticed something unusual. The area surrounding the eyes was not preserved in the same way as the rest of the face. While most of the skin had dried and contracted in predictable patterns, the region around the eyelids showed a different kind of stability.
It hadn't simply shrunk with time. It had held its shape.
Almost as if that part of the face had been treated differently from the beginning.
At first, this suggested a technical explanation.
Perhaps some form of early preservation method had been applied, something subtle, something targeted.
Ancient civilizations did understand preservation to a certain degree. They used oils, resins, plant extracts.
But applying that knowledge with such precision, to such a delicate area, raises a difficult question.
Were they just preserving the body? Or were they trying to control how it would be seen? The deeper analysis made things even more complicated.
Because traces within the eye region hinted that parts of the internal structure had not completely degraded.
Not fully intact, not perfectly preserved, but not entirely gone either. And that's a problem. Because the human eye is one of the most fragile parts of the body. After death, it is usually one of the first to collapse. For anything to remain recognizable after thousands of years, something unusual must have happened. Either the environment was extraordinarily specific, or someone interfered with the natural process. This is where the discussion begins to shift. Some researchers started looking beyond biology and chemistry, and into behavior. Into intention.
In certain ancient belief systems, sight was more than just a function, it was a symbol of presence. The idea that the dead could still observe, in some form, was not entirely uncommon.
But here's the issue.
Those beliefs were usually expressed through art, through carvings, through painted eyes on masks.
Not through manipulating the actual body in such a precise and controlled way. Which leads to a more uncomfortable possibility. What if this was not symbolic at all? What if the goal was not just to represent awareness, but to create it? Not in a literal, living sense, but in perception.
Because there is something specific about partially closed eyes.
They place the human brain in a state of uncertainty.
You don't immediately categorize the face as fully lifeless.
Instead, your attention lingers. You look longer. You question what you're seeing. And maybe that was the point. Not preservation, but impact.
A controlled impression that would last far beyond the moment of burial.
If that's true, then this mummy is not just a body.
It's a message designed to be seen in a very particular way.
But even that doesn't fully resolve the mystery.
Because the biological contradiction still remains.
The muscles behaved as expected. The natural process should have completed itself.
And yet, the final position suggests something interrupted that process at exactly the right moment, and then held it there, permanently.
So now we are left between explanations. Was it environment? Technique? Belief? Or something we still don't fully understand? Because the more closely this case is studied, the less it fits into a single category.
It sits at the intersection of biology, ritual, and perception, never fully belonging to any one of them.
And maybe that's why it continues to hold attention.
Not because it gives us answers, but because it refuses to settle into one. The eyes remain exactly as they were found, neither fully open nor fully closed.
Suspended in a moment that should have passed, but never did.
In the next part, the investigation goes deeper. Because new evidence begins to suggest that this was not an isolated case. That similar patterns may exist in other discoveries, and that the explanation might not lie in the body at all, but in something far more controlled than we expected. If you found this story intriguing, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys unexplained mysteries, and subscribe to the channel.
And if you have your own theory about what really happened here, leave it in the comments.